Hi everyone, and today we're going to discuss a little bit more about how we're going to eat in 2030, which is not that long time, it's only 7 years, so it's a medium time span. And today in the panel, I'm with Catherine Tubb. She's the Director of Research at Synthesis Capital, which is the largest food tech focused VC fund. And she also writes about technology-driven disruptions and what food we will eat next. In 2019, she co-authored a report about rethinking food and agriculture, so we'll discuss that a little bit more shortly. Benjamina is the founder and CEO of Cambridge-based Uncommon Bio. The company leverages advanced cellular technologies, including the Nobel Prize-winning and RNA-based approach to cultivate meat products, and starting with pork and pork belly. And she has a strong foundation in chemical engineering from Imperial College, and already had a diverse career across different fields of technology and electronics. And Max is the co-founder of Hoxton Farms. They grow real animal fat, but without the animals, and which is a very important ingredient for the taste of meat alternatives. Max has a PhD in SynBio from Oxford and 2 degrees in biotech and business from Cambridge. Very impressive. He has spent the past decade in the UK and the US using biotech to solve problems in healthcare, climate, and food. So with this very impressive panel, I'm excited to, maybe before we start speaking about the future, let's dive into the past. So to start with, I would love to ask the panel how you've seen your personal food habits change in the last 10 years, which is roughly the time span that we have going forward, and also what you've seen in the market and how that has affected your learnings as founders or investors.
Do you want to start?
Sure. I guess for me, you don't really have to go back 10 years. You just have to go back 5 that look very different even 5 years ago. I guess for me personally, I do eat a lot less meat, but I am a meat eater. But in the market, I just think the growing acceptance around technologically driven food has kind of increased a bit, although also decreased at the same time. So I'm just excited to see where it's going to go.
Yeah, I think personally it's not hugely changed. I tried many times to reduce my meat consumption, but unfortunately didn't manage to. And I think when we look actually at the world as a whole, not much has changed. I think there's been a lot of growing trends, but a lot of them actually represent maybe 1%, 5%, 10%. But when we look at what the majority even of the UK buys, meat, potatoes, rice, a lot of the same things that they did before. And if you look at the plates, actually a lot of them are the same. So there's a lot of trends, and sometimes I think within, especially tech circles, we have the impression a lot is moving, but it's moving exponentially within a certain small percentage.
Yeah, Benjamina, you said it. My eating habits haven't changed anywhere near as much over the last decade as they should have. I love eating meat. I love the way it smells and sizzles and browns. I think it's an incredibly important part of my culture and what I enjoy doing with friends. And over the last decade, it's been pretty difficult to give that up because the alternatives just aren't good enough. As you both said, like many other people, I feel the same pressure because of environment, ethics, climate, to reduce the amount of meat that I eat, because I know that it's killing the planet as well as killing us. But I'm unwilling to compromise on all of the enjoyment that I get from traditional meat. And I think that's, in no small way why we're all here, because we're trying to make alternatives that don't demand so much compromise, so that people like me will hopefully transition away from eating meat, and much quicker than in the next 10 years.
Great. And Catherine, moving on to you, in your report in 2019, and I know that's maybe a little bit outdated now, but I think it's fun to look back on old things and what the research and the thinking was a few years ago. You predicted that there would be a sharp decline in our consumption of, in particular, cow products and beef. And with the context that you have now, and I think the whole panel actually agrees that there have been some change, but it hasn't been that significant over the last 5 to 10 years, or not as much as we would have hoped to see. Tell us a little bit more about your predictions and how have you seen that change in your report?
Yeah, so the report we wrote is very much based on technology and the idea of how technology disruptions happen. So we applied a specific framework to food. And I think we see this across loads of technology disruptions over time, that for a product to be disruptive, it has to be good enough and cheap enough. And how you define that with food is it has to be good enough for the rational consumer, which in this case would be a meat eater. It's not to say that meat is irrational, it's saying that in this case that's kind of the rational consumer. And I think while in our report we kind of identified 2 specific areas and how we get to that rapid adoption, and really it's about that cost coming down and the product improving. And as I think we've kind of all inferred and said, is at the moment the products out there just simply aren't good enough. Like, the reason you would pick a plant-based product is often because there is an environmental reason or a sustainability reason, not because it meets that kind of meaty flavor, texture, emotion that we want from our food. But that's kind of where there's a lot of technologies very close to coming to market that are really going to change that, and we'll see an elevation in how good the products are. And then as that improves, you see the costs coming down at the same time, like all kind of technologies have seen over time. And there'll be a point where the cost is good enough that essentially you see a rapid adoption. That adoption is probably going to be more like the early 2030s now, but when it happens, it'll be really fast because everything is adopted via S-curves. It's a really common adoption portfolio. It's just how things happen. And if you think about now, the kind of breaks to adoption in terms of regulation, even consumer acceptance, they can all flip extremely quickly. If investment moves away from the old system, we stop giving kind of cow farmers their subsidies and everything switches towards a new system because it's better. So I think we still see that S-curve, but I think perhaps the tipping point is perhaps pushed a bit further out. And there's still a lot of work to be done, which these guys are doing, and we're seeing loads of companies in the space working on as well.
And getting Benjamina's and Mac's perspective on that, because you're obviously both founders in adjacent areas, and I know scalability is a big topic for you, and also the cost and unit economics for any of these innovative products. How do you see, how do you think about scalability and technology, and what have you seen during your years as a founders? Like, are costs coming down? What technologies are, not only theoretical, but you can actually apply and start using in your day-to-day business for those predictions to actually happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a lot. We've seen the cost come down drastically. It's still not at a level where it's viable for anyone to sell it. But what we see is the biotech sector as well is improving in parallel to us, and a lot of the technologies happening there we can use, and we can improve our own technologies. At the same time, us as an industry, the supply chain is improving. There's more and more companies. We are getting more funding. All of that is really accelerating all of the scalability. And I think it's not just about the technology, but also about things like financing. So you're seeing more equipment financing, for example. Mm-hmm. So companies that will allow you to get way better terms to buy all those equipment that will allow us to scale. So I think it's really thinking about it from a 360 perspective. And there was a lot of issues around the supply chain with COVID that are now slowly getting a little bit better. It's still a little bit of a mess, but it's slowly getting better. And I think that also will accelerate when we don't have to wait, for example, a whole year to receive the container in which we grow ourselves.
I think fundamentally success in this industry, and not just success in the industry, but creating the impact in the world that we want to create, comes down to 2 things, to cost and to scale. And they're really two sides of the same coin. There are two ways that you can bring the cost down as you scale. The first is coming up with better technology that makes your process efficient and therefore cheaper. And secondly, it's just harnessing economies of scale. As a company, we have expensive inputs, and the more of them that we can buy at once, the cheaper they are per unit. But the real challenge comes with finding the capital or the technology, the means to jump this gap from where we are now, which is relatively small, making grams and kilograms, to where we need to be, which is making millions of tons of product every year. And this is especially true for Hoxton Farms because we're an ingredients company. We make a small part of the finished product, and therefore to build a sustainable business, we need to get cost and scale right to an even greater degree of success than lots of other people. It's a tough challenge, and fundamentally, I think people are used to seeing scale in the terms of the computing industry. Everyone loves Moore's law, this exponential growth in the rate of computing power. But the problem is that biology is not like semiconductors. Biology doesn't scale in the same way. The biology of a bacterium is really different to the biology of a blue whale, and that's roughly the increase in scale that we need to go through as an industry. You can't make a blue whale by just putting lots and lots of bacteria together. Which is unlike the way that you can make a big computer by putting lots and lots of smaller computers together. There is difficult technology for us to solve here, which is obviously why it's such a fun problem, but it is why it will take a bit longer than the computing industry scaled up in the 90s, for example.
Yeah, and I think just to add, we also, I think as an industry, have to be careful about how fast we scale. In recent news, for example, one of the other players in the field has spent, tens of millions scaling way too fast and then lost all that money because the technology wasn't ready and had issues around that. And I think it's important that we scale fast, but also scale at the right speed without then just burning tens of millions of cash and, some cases hundreds of million to then not have much to show for it.
Yeah, and this is definitely one place where the industry can work together, right? Because we all have to spend so much capital on building infrastructure. Again, it's not like scaling an app by building another service center. And that infrastructure is often best shared between companies. And so that's one way in which we can all come together and hopefully make this journey of building a kind of factory that no one's built before a lot cheaper and less risky.
Yeah, and there are people, for example, 3 big companies, so Buehler, Migros, and then Givaudan, 3 large multinationals in Switzerland have come together to do a pilot plan that companies like ourselves can use, and they have the capital to take the risk. So more of that.
The industry and government buy-in is extremely important, I think, for this. I've done a piece of work recently looking and comparing electric vehicle kind of scale up. So if you look at electric vehicles in the US 20 years ago, people weren't even considering electric vehicles as the answer. People were talking about fuel efficiency, alternative fuels, but generally hydrogen, and that was just in 2005. And very quickly, as soon as you kind of see that technology being de-risked, which is through projects like this, you just see a huge government and industry buy-in. And I think that could be a really kind of key moment for the industry of seeing that de-risking, with kind of Tesla moment, although I don't know if we'll have a Tesla of the alternative protein space, that proof that you can scale it up and you can do it, and that's when you'll see a lot more money coming in. The next 10 years in the US for electric vehicles has seen more funding come for it than you've seen in the previous 20. So that just shows how much, I've calculated over 250 billion or something just in the US alone for electric vehicles, and that dwarfs kind of what we've seen in the previous 20 years.
So maybe, and then the question on that to the founders. So when do you think that inflection point will come for cultivated meat, particular, because that's the area that you're both working with?
It's a hard one. I think when we talk about when we start having kind of product market fit, when we start reaching some scale as a company, we talk about kind of 3 to 5 years. I think as an industry, probably 2030 is where we start being at some inflection point.
Yeah.
we won't have, I don't think we'll have, 30, 40, 50% of the protein market by then, but I think it's that point where we're really starting to get much, much bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, both requires for both of you to have regulatory approval and products out in the market, and hopefully good products in the market. Good. And Catherine, you wrote a bit about software and the impact of software and on the faster development in the food industry. And I know that you, Max, have been quite vocal about AI and how that can help you innovate. So would be very interested to hear how you've used that in your business to date and how that has helped you scale or go even faster, if at all.
Yes, it definitely has. My co-founder, Ed, as well as being my oldest childhood friend, we've known each other for 30 years, is a mathematician by background. And before we came together to work on food, he was using machine learning to solve problems in industry, maybe even before it was cool. I think I can say that because most of today's conference seems to be about AI and ML. We use ML to make our process cheaper and more scalable, which, like I said before, are by far the two most important things. We've got all of these complex and expensive inputs into a multi-step production process. And that's a perfect example for using big data to optimize the process and make it as cheap and as high quality as possible. So we spend a lot of time gathering data, data that we observe about the way our cells grow and the way our fat tastes, and using that data to build models which allow us to optimize the entire thing in the computer without having to do loads and loads and loads of experiments in the kitchen, which would take a lot of time and money.
So in short, you've managed to scale down the iteration process through the software.
Exactly.
Amazing. Maybe going back a little bit to what we think will happen in 2030 then, which is the core question. I mean, in hindsight, looking at the development in the past years, where do you think, what do you think the core things will be? What are the core things that will have changed in the next 7 to 10 years across food trends?
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it is that from just a looks perspective, not much will have changed. I don't think we'll be just having shakes or pills or, we'll be eating, there's companies building it, but I don't think we'll be eating some exotic animals. I think in the same way as, unfortunately, we ate hundreds of years ago chicken, and today we still eat chicken, but our chicken has way more antibiotics and pumped with water and salt and all these things, but we still call it chicken. I think I'd hope and I believe that our plates will look very similar, but actually the way in which everything is made, the way things will taste, will be of a much higher quality and better for our health by not having antibiotics, but being more sustainable and be affordable still. And actually, hopefully, if we look at the way the farming industry is today, there's a lot of subsidies, and actually we see over time our industry being able to not need that and still have the right cost. It will take time, but we see it getting there. There's no reason not to.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think by 2030, I'm hoping that our plates, the production of the products on our plates are done much more without an animal, but you're still getting that taste and flavor and nutritional content that you want. But I think we'll still be in a very early phase in terms of building up the production, but hopefully there'll be a lot more proof. We'll see a lot of hybrid products on the market, which are kind of all these technologies mixed together to kind of produce the best tasting, best nutrition profile that we can. But yeah, certainly I agree with Benjamina, it won't be that much different.
Yeah. And at the risk of saying the same as both of you, which you said very well, I think the whole point is that We don't want people's diets to change. Now, in the very distant future, there's this hope that people will eat a lot less meat. And if everybody ate plants, it would fundamentally be a lot more efficient and a lot better for the planet. And who knows, maybe better for humans as well, but that's a separate debate. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. In the West, the vast majority of people still eat a lot of meat. And in most of the global South, the appetite for meat is growing exponentially. So this is a trend that's moving in the wrong direction if you're trying to stop people eat meat at all. But the whole point is helping them eat meat that comes from a much more sustainable place. And in that sense, I would hope that people's diets or the way that their plates look like in a decade won't change at all. But in a generation, we will be able to look back and see a complete transformation in where our food comes from. And it might taste better too.
Yeah, and I think we all talk about meat, but I think just to maybe conclude on that question, I think it applies to everything. It applies to even our vegetables, to our grains, to I think everything from a quality perspective has quite deteriorated unless you go for the really high end. And hopefully there is that mass quality that we can achieve through technology across the plate. In meat and elsewhere.
And that's a really important point to make about this technology, that it's not kind of against regenerative agriculture. It actually should work quite well with it, because essentially we're going to be freeing up land that is currently being used to grow plants to feed animals. But if you can do that without an animal, then you're doing it more efficiently, and hopefully that should allow for much better sustainable farming practices, so that ultimately we can feed more people with less land, which is kind of really the key point. It's all about efficiency, sadly.
It's a very agreeable panel. So I was hoping for some new pills that will, or insects or something like that. But
insects are a red herring.
Nobody wants to eat insects.
No one wants to eat insects. It's only because they are used to feed animals. So we wouldn't invest in insects. I don't understand insects. It's the biofuels of alternative.
Got it. I think the conclusion from the panel is quite clear on that point. So let's move on. I wanted to touch a little bit upon the role of regulation of food innovation, and I mean, especially for you, that's something that is a big topic on the agenda. And I'm sure you, Catherine, think about it a lot as well while investing in new areas and new companies. So how do you see, the role of regulation driving innovation? I know that you both have thought about it a lot, depending on where you decide to base your business or go to market.
I don't think regulation drives innovation. I think regulation supports innovation, or at least it should. And I'll get onto this, but sometimes, of course, regulation holds back innovation, and that's where it's not doing its job. Before I was working on food, I was working on clinical drug discovery, where regulation is really important too. And for a kind of similar version of those reasons, regulation does matter a lot in food. We need to make ingredients which are safe for people to eat, and we need to be really sure that we keep track of whether they continue to be safe when we produce them at really big scales. But the problem is that regulation isn't moving fast enough for cultivated meat in particular. The processes that we use are kind of complicated, at least to the regulators. And teaching regulators to see what we do as kind of no more high-tech than the process of brewing beer or baking bread is a pretty long and arduous process. There are some countries where the regulators are more enlightened, and that's gone more quickly. Shout out to Singapore, who regulated cultivated meat first of all, and then the US, who followed pretty soon after, and the first two products were approved in the US this year. But in the UK, for example, we still have a long way to go. And I would say in the UK, the government has to do a lot more work and a lot more joined-up thinking before it really does support the innovation that we know is really important for food security and kind of the innovation that the UK does want to foster.
You wanted some controversy, so here we go. I personally think, for example, the US has been too kind on some of the regulation. I think it's less past things that I personally wouldn't... I eat maybe out of curiosity, but I might spit it later. And I think doesn't have enough data to support passing. And I think the question is, how do we ensure the highest quality while speeding up? At the moment, the regulators in the UK and elsewhere, and particularly UK and Europe, are massively underfunded, and so they're way too slow. There's way too little people. But I just think we have to be extremely careful with not lowering the standards in any product recall. Anything of that sort could be extremely damaging to the whole sector. And we've seen it in the therapeutic space where, for example, there's products that went through regulatory approval, got approved, and then there were damages. The whole industry suffered in regenerative medicine for several years from it. And companies that had raised hundreds of millions went down. And so it's really important that we keep the quality while doing it faster. So some of the things is, can companies pay more to go faster? Can, for example, we move things that are slightly more important than cannabinoids, and things that will really make a change to the whole country to be on top of of the pile when it comes to this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll probably agree with both. It's incredibly important, as Benjamina says, that we kind of do regulation in the right way. Obviously, as a VC, we want that regulation to happen fast. So it's getting that right balance. But I do think regulation can just be a switch. Once it's switched on, that's fine. So it's best that you switch it on at the right time. So it's kind of thinking about it like that. It's hard to switch it off again, and you don't want to have to switch it off again. So I think, it's about timing. I mean, exactly, UK is really slow, but it's about, can we support that better in the right way rather than necessarily speeding it up? It doesn't have to be sped up, it just has to be done in the right way. And a lot of companies are having active discussions in the US, and you guys, I'm sure, are as well, with the regulators. So that's really important as well, that we work together as an industry.
And unavoidable topic when it comes to food. Many of plant-based products went to market and launched and then faced a relatively tough last 2 years, where we even seen data on consumer demand or the sales of plant-based products declining a little bit. It doesn't necessarily reflect the demand. What happened, and what are the learnings that you're implementing in your businesses, how you're building them today?
The plant-based industry isn't doing as badly as I think people think. Mm-hmm. There is a massively inflationary macroeconomic environment, so there is a big slowdown in consumer spending. And every time that happens, the first place that people really watch their spending is in the supermarket. And therefore, people are just spending less on food, and they're especially spending less on expensive food. And because plant-based food is still a pretty nascent industry, still relatively premium in supermarkets, it's been particularly badly affected. But so have the traditional meat companies. Smithfield Foods, one of the biggest meat manufacturers in the US, just shut down 4 meat packing plants, for example. So there is an effect across the board. It's not just affecting plant-based. And indeed, in countries like the UK and Germany, over the last year or so, demand for plant-based meat has been relatively robust, even growing. So the picture's not as dire as some people are painting. But plant-based still has a problem. Like I said right at the beginning, it just doesn't taste good enough. And the biggest reason that people don't repeat purchase plant-based meat is taste, quickly followed by cost. And I think that speaks to exactly the problem that we're all trying to solve, which is making plant-based meat taste better. So as long as the industry survives through these turbulent waters, then we'll be right there on the other side to pick it up and fix it.
Yeah, I think, as you said, they have a huge problem of retention. If you look at products that people are meant to consume on a daily basis, usually you'll have 70, 80, 90% even retention. Something like bread, for example, would have those numbers. Whereas plant-based, companies having 26% retention are floating it because the industry average is more around 15%. And so if you're having to spend all this money to get new consumers because you're constantly having like a leaky bucket, then that becomes a problem. And I think the other thing is the amount of money and the valuations that came with those businesses. A lot of them might still be great businesses, just not at the valuations.
Yeah.
And with the defensibility and that came with it, they don't necessarily have the tech that, for example, we have, where, for example, we could have an extra revenue stream through a more traditional biotech company or through licensing, where that can balance out and justify higher valuations.
Yeah, as an investor, I think there's plenty of money around, but there's definitely a higher bar to getting it than there was perhaps 2 years ago. Exactly as Benjamina says, we've seen kind of I would argue, inflated valuations. Maybe you guys don't agree. And we're just seeing a bit more caution, especially in kind of how we're deploying our capital. We're kind of making sure the companies are trying to be really manage their cash carefully. There's kind of more about key KPIs in there as well. So I think it's just a bit of a shift in power, I guess, that as investors we can demand a little bit more from the companies and the founders than we could a couple of years ago, which is not necessarily a bad thing, by the way.
Great. I think we're out of time, so I thank you very much for all the insights that you've shared with the audience today. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.